I'm a health psychologist, a psychotherapist, and a director of the clinical health psychology practice, Mind Body Blossom. So my practice focuses on supporting people with health issues or dealing with difficulties with mood, but also having complications of dealing with physical health issues or persistent physical symptoms. And previously, I've worked in the NHS, and I did my PhD and worked in research in King's College London in the health psychology department. And I continue to contribute to research and develop exciting health psychology interventions with lots of my clinical academic friends. So I'm very keen to kind of spread and promote evidence-based practice. And I'm always happy to have the opportunity to share kind of the most simplistic ways that we can utilize what we know from the research. And that's what I hope that we can do today when we're considering stress and how we can work with mind and body to mitigate its effects. So this is what we'll cover. We're going to first of all understand the difference between eustress and chronic stress. There's a lot of fear around stress, a lot of stress about being stressed or anxiety about being anxious, and hopefully we can create some clarity there of what's happening when we're stressed in the body and why we don't need to automatically fear it, and also what we can do when we do start to feel worried about it. And that brings us to our next objective, which is using strategies to tune into signs of stress early. So how we can spot feeling stressed before maybe we traditionally do. Generally, we tend to have this kind of trip switch that we notice where we're like, okay, things are stacking up, but I'm just powering through. And then suddenly everything feels overwhelming. And at the point where things are stacking up, usually that's further on than we feel able to intervene in, because everything feels urgent and it feels like we can't put anything down. So if we can intervene a little bit earlier, we have lots more scope for changing things and working with our biology and improving how we feel emotionally as well as physically. And that brings us to number 3, which is feeling confident in making steps towards just little lifestyle tweaks to mitigate stress. And generally, when people talk about lifestyle tweaks or changes to lifestyle, we think about physical activity and diet and all of that kind of stuff, which of course is important. But here, I'm going to be looking at a little bit of the minutiae about just how we approach our day-to-day from like an emotional standpoint, and also from an attitudinal shift, moving away from sense of like, I need to do at least 30 minutes of something or it's not worth it, to what little bit can I do that might have an impact, and feeling good about that, even when it is only 3 minutes or 30 seconds or whatever it might be. So hopefully by the end of it, you'll feel up to date on some of the mind body science behind stress, less alarmed by the experience of stress itself, and more confident and able and motivated to use particular strategies to help work with stress preemptively and as it arises. So to start with, I'm going to introduce the concept of the nervous system, eustress, and chronic stress. So I guess just to introduce the nervous system, there's a lot more awareness now of nervous system with things like nervous system regulation practices and lots of interesting, and some of it entirely misguiding, social media content about how we regulate our nervous system and what that means and how that happens. There tends to be a misunderstanding about what the nervous system is. The nervous system is vast, but it often gets kind of reduced down to one particular part. So just to broaden out, when we talk about the nervous system's the brain, the spinal cord, and the networks of nerves throughout our body. And it orchestrates pretty much everything that needs to be orchestrated to keep us alive, to keep us functioning, to keep us engaging. But there are sub-branches within the nervous system. So we've got the central nervous system, which is our brain, our spinal cord, and our nerves. And then we've got the peripheral nervous system, which is further subdivided into our enteric nervous system. So this, you guys probably as professionals with an interest in diet and dietetics, if not dietitians yourself, will know about the enteric nervous system, which is the network of 100 million neurons that sit in our digestive tract from the lower 1/3 of our esophagus all the way down to the rectum and the anus. And this is called the second brain because that network of neurons are so independent. 90% of them are there dedicated to send messages back up to our brain rather than receiving messages from our brain, which is quite unlike many other organ systems in our body. It means that our gut can calculate things and send messages back up without the brain asking for it. So there's a rich network of interesting things going on there, which impact our gut microbiome, which impact our metabolic system, which impacts lots of different things in our body, but it also impacts our immune system and, of course, how we're feeling and what's happening in our mood and how we process stress. Then we've got the somatic nervous system. So this is the network of nerves and structures that allow us to feel sensory experiences. And then we've got the autonomic nervous system, which has a sub-branch, again, of the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system is the kind of activating branch of the autonomic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system is the kind of equalizing branch or the deactivating branch of the autonomic nervous system. Even as I say that, that's not quite right. So I'm going to zoom back for a second and explain the autonomic nervous system. This is our inbuilt autonomic nervous system, autonomic, i.e. automatic. It's been wired up and evolved in order for us to have quick reactions to help us survive and thrive so that we can quickly act on information that we need to act on, and we can navigate stresses and threats. And it was evolved for us in our most primitive forms, but much of the mechanics of it remains the same. So we still need these quick fire responses, and it's the autonomic nervous system that orchestrates all of that. And in doing so, we need to have this kind of counterbalancing subsection, really, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. But when we talk about the parasympathetic nervous system as being deactivating, it's not quite right, because the parasympathetic nervous system activates lots of things like our digestion. So why it's posed generally as a deactivating system, that's in relationship to the sympathetic response. It deactivates that sympathetic response. And the reason this is important is because this is the sub-branch of the nervous system that has increasing focus on it. As people become more and more aware of the fight or flight stress response, they're identifying this sub-branch of the nervous system as the instigator and terminator of that fight or flight stress response. And that's quite right. When we get stressed, we get this sympathetic nervous system arousal, which means that our brain sends messages to particular glands to secrete particular stress hormones, or hormones that then secrete stress hormones, which then circulate through our body. And these stress hormones bind to our organs and our muscles to change how they're functioning. And that exact change will vary depending on the degree of the stress hormones, the proportion of different types of stress hormones, the context, and all sorts of different things. But you'll have all experienced that sympathetic nervous system kick in many, many times in your life. If you're going to give a talk and your mouth goes dry, that's one of the effects of our sympathetic nervous system. If you're going to do something new for the first time and you get that adrenaline shake, that's an effect of our sympathetic nervous system activating. If you're preparing for an interview or for something that's really important to you and you've got a little bit of a wait before it and you're pacing back and forth and going over and over the same thing in your head and feeling unable to sit down, that's your sympathetic nervous system. And generally speaking, when the stressor that has elicited that response passes or goes away or reduces, that's when our parasympathetic nervous system comes back online to deactivate that sympathetic nervous system response, to wash out the stress hormones, and to get our organs coming back to their equilibrium. So the digestion can come back on, our heart can slow down again, our salivary response can go back to usual, and whatever else has changed, it comes back to some kind of restoration. And this autonomic nervous system is fully equipped to do that automatically without any intervention from us. And it does it over and over again. And so it's quite safe. It can be really uncomfortable, but it doesn't automatically mean that we're doing any harm to our body or any harm is coming to our body. And so this is where we want to introduce this concept of eustress. When we become aware of this role of our autonomic nervous system and that our sympathetic nervous system gets activated in the face of a stressor or demand, our brain might automatically dichotomize sympathetic equals bad, parasympathetic equals good, being stressed equals bad, it's changing what's happening in my body and I need to get back to balance. But if we step back from that automatic kind of heuristic labeling and appraisal that happens in our brain in an effort to protect us, and become familiar with this concept of eustress. So eustress is that fight or flight stress response, our sympathetic nervous system activating in order to allow us to do the things that we need to do. You'll be having sympathetic nervous system activation throughout the day, whether or not you're psychologically stressed, or whether or not you feel like that your demands are outweighing your capacity, because this is the nature of our body. In order to activate, to do things, we need this sympathetic nervous system to kind of kick in to allow us to do things. When I sit down to my emails and I've got 10 of them, I might not be feeling the most stressed I've ever felt, but I know I need to get through them. And my sympathetic nervous system activates to help me get through it. When I am contemplating after having lunch whether to go out and walk the dog, and feeling resistant because it's cold outside, but knowing that I need to do it, when I finally make that decision to get up, it's my sympathetic nervous system that's activating to help me get up from my chair, do all this stuff, get out of the house and get moving. So there's lots of benign ways that our sympathetic nervous system is activated in order to help us get active in particular ways, cognitively, emotionally, physically, and that's called eustress. And there's this bell curve whereby the degree of stress that we're under, or the degree of kind of stress activation in our body kind of goes up to allow us to utilize it in kind of an optimum and helpful way. But it's a bell curve. It goes up too little and it's no good. As we go up, it gets better and our output gets more. And then at some point it goes down again and we experience too much and it goes in the opposite direction. And that's just like, again, something that you probably can relate to when you've had just enough pressure to get that thing off your desk finally, or just enough pressure to get moving to go wherever you need to go. It's helpful. But if it goes too far, when things have stacked up too much, or you've got someone shouting at you, or feeling really judged, or whatever it might be, and it goes beyond an amount that is helpful, and then it becomes inhibiting and you find it impossible to get started, or you feel resistant to doing it. So we're aiming for that kind of bell curve ideally, and in finding that, we can really befriend our stress response. But as we're all aware, the accumulation of stress is unhelpful. I don't like using the word bad, really. Stress is not bad at all, but the accumulation of it is unhelpful to us. I think I'll change this slide for the future. When we are talking about the accumulation of stress, people often think about that as in, a particular time period. Oh God, I've had this thing after this thing after. I was just describing my week actually, and I was talking about one thing after another, workshops on evenings, clinic during the day, conference coming up. And you could understand how one might think, gosh, but these are all, stressful things. demand stacking up? Is that what we mean by accumulation of stress? And although I'll likely feel quite physically and mentally affected and by the experience of doing all of these different things, we're not talking about that as being like a dangerous or bad thing for our body. It's something that our bodies generally are able to withstand and deal with and help us come back to an equilibrium. When we talk about the accumulation of stress to the degree that it becomes chronic, we're talking about being overtaxed week after week, month after month, accumulating into a big, long stretch. And of course, we're looking at multiple factors: the consistency, frequency, degree, and duration, all of those things together. So I could be having this kind of a week over and over and over for some months. It will stack up. It will have some kind of an impact on how I'm feeling, but there'll be flexibility there for me to kind of come back to restoration. However, if I had week after week of this going on for a much longer period, and if there was extra stressful elements dropped into that to increase the degree of stress, then I'm going to have less of a duration for me to be able to withstand that, and I'm going to experience the effects of that quicker. So I always want to kind of talk about time periods when we're thinking about stress and the accumulation of it, because when we are stressed and when we are experiencing stress about stress, perhaps because we're feeling the effects, our brain tends to go into threat detecting mode, and it starts to make these calculations about, what that means for our body, what that means for us, and it can get very, very fearful. So we want to contextualize. There's multiple moving parts. Okay. So the next bit then I'd like to introduce you to is when we are talking about chronic stress as opposed to the acute stress response. We're talking about stress building up in your body over a long period of time in different sorts of ways. So at the top of this, we've got our usual adaptation to stress, right? We experience the activity or the stressor where we get a physiological arousal, and it's not just one marker of physiological arousal. There's the autonomic nervous system activation, which will change our hormones, but that will also affect our cardiovascular system. Maybe it'll affect our blood sugar, blood pressure, etc., etc., etc. So we get a range of different physiological things changing. And then at a certain point, we habituate and we come back down to recovery, and then we can remain at our baseline. That's what happens when everything's running as it should. However, when we experience chronic stress, we go through a process of that getting warped. So what might happen is we get this natural response to stress where we see it go from baseline to elevated. We come back down to baseline, but we keep getting elevations over and over and over again because of the experience of lots of stresses or internalized stresses. And we can talk a little bit about kind of differentiating internal versus external in a moment. But over and over again, we get this repeated stress response, which makes it really jagged across our entire physiology, right? It's not optimum for getting back to a nice bodily balance. Another way that this can then change how our body is and our physiology is this lack of adaptation. So if we get these repeated hits over time, at some point, rather than coming back down to baseline as we are here, we kind of keep going like this, right? So this remains up. And really what should be happening, ideally, if everything's healthy and we're not too overtaxed, is that we get, I don't know how well you can see the differentiation, but we've got these little kind of triangle-y ones here. When our body's functioning optimally, healthily, and things are as they should be, rather than keep going up to here like this, we start to kind of have this natural ceiling of the stress response. And over time, the same stressor or the same instigator of this response elicits less and less and less, and we can adapt, and our body withstands it. And this can be really helpful to us in lots of ways. It can also cause us kind of problems because for example, living in a really frenetic household where there's lots of shouting and there's lots of doors banging and arguments and what have you, our system might adapt. It might kind of top out that top end of stress so that we don't kind of get that big palpitation every time we hear someone shout or the door slam and we're kind of zoned out of it. But it doesn't mean that that situation still isn't stressful. It just means our body's kind of stopping to respond to it in that way. So in that sense, it can end up meaning that we normalize a lot of stressful experiences. But that would be a whole entire workshop in itself. Then we've got another way that our body can change in relation to chronic stress, which is rather than come back down, which is quite a lot of effort. It's this back and forth between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. So every peak is this sympathetic nervous system in activation, but every time you have to get all the way back down there, this parasympathetic nervous system is pretty taxed. So instead of that, our body might decide to just kind of keep up there. So we get this increased, spoiler alert, increased sympathetic nervous system activation just maintained for a long period of time. And you might relate to this or be able to spot this in patients where people are just constantly on high alert and vigilant. This is where you might a lot of my patients with health anxiety might be in this state because they're suddenly super aware of all the different physical sensations they're experiencing, and it's making them feel anxious and like something's wrong. And then that makes them more aware of sensations. The sensations ramp up. They get more fearful thoughts about it, and so on and so forth. Or outside of a health context, it might be that you come to the end of your working day, and rather than it being easy to put the laptop lid down, sit down, curl up on the couch and have a cup of tea, your brain's racing. It's like, no, I need to do the next thing and get the next thing prepped for next day, and what about this, that and the other. So it doesn't it's not a million miles away from where lots of us kind of end up seeing our nervous system kind of get stuck, or not just nervous system, but our kind of physiological systems get stuck over time. And then on the other end of things, we can run out of physiological resource. It's very metabolically taxing for this to keep happening, to keep getting up there, keep having to come down again if we're able to. And so our body might just simply not have the resources, and then there's this inadequate response. And when there's that inadequate response, it can correspond with our mood. We might feel lower, we might feel more lethargic, might have less motivation. And physiologically, we just feel like heavier and it's harder to get moving. And we might feel lots of kind of depressing effects physiologically in different ways on our health. Immune system being depleted, for example, getting ill with lots of viruses or recurrent infections and things like that. So whichever response we potentially experience, what it means is there's a lot of physiological changes happening in our body as a result, and that is likely to affect our health in lots of different ways, as well as our mental health, because the two are intertwined. And just to illustrate that out a little bit, this research here I've referenced McEwen. This was like one of his seminal papers in 1998, but since then there's decades and decades of his research that's built on this hypothesis. And so we know that these allostatic systems do get changed and molded by our experiences of stress and trauma and demands exceeding our resources. And so when we talk about allostatic load, what we're talking about is these four allostatic systems getting overwhelmed. So just to introduce you to these pillars of our overall health and functioning, we've got the neuroendocrine system. So the neuroendocrine system is our brain and our hormones, and our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system. So when we perceive a stressor, that's our brain having some electrical activity, which then signals to our particular glands to secrete stress hormones. This is where our endocrine system is, our hormones, and then that ends up activating our autonomic nervous system, just as I described before, and that's our nervous system element. But the thing is, these pillars work together, right? So this doesn't really happen in a silo. this is likely to impact our immune system function. So seminal studies that have since again had decades of research investigating it even more, all of which is totally fascinating. But there's one study in particular by Glaser et al. In 1994. And they looked at a group of stress carers, and they compared this group to a non-stressed group that was matched to them. So there was the same mix of genders, ages, etc. On every other variable apart from being stressed, they were pretty much matched. And they all got given a little punch biopsy wound, same length, uniformed. And they just measured how long it took for the group of stress carers versus the non-stressed group to heal from the wound. And what they found was the group of stress carers took 24% longer. So that was 9 days longer to heal than the non-stress group. And what this has led to is this understanding that our psychological stress experiences impact our neuroendocrine system, which impacts our immune system, which means that our inflammatory processes are changed, our immune system's capacity to produce and mobilize natural killer cells and immune cells is impeded, and that means it takes longer for us to fight off infection and heal from wounds. Similarly, our cardiovascular system and our metabolic systems also interact with our neuroendocrine and immune system. So just in that stress response example that I gave you before, when you're feeling nervous about something, the neuroendocrine system, the hormone changes impact on your heart. It beats quicker. We might get an increase in blood pressure. That might change how our metabolic system's working, because suddenly we're having to burn more energy. That might change our blood sugar. All of this might change then how our immune system's functioning. So these things are all highly interconnected, working together all of the time. And if one's impacted, if there was a little crack here, the other pillars can kind of withstand our health. But if there appears to be more of but they take more strain for one. And if there's ongoing cracks, then it starts to impact on the others. And then the structural integrity is kind of just weakened overall. And so it's really important for us to look after all of these metabolic systems, all of these allostatic systems as best we can. But of course, it's hard sometimes. Environment, circumstance, what have you, can make that difficult. But we can pour in a little bit and often, and we'll get to that in a moment. But this is where I'd like to introduce you to the more experiential part of the workshop, which is trying to help you recognize what's happening in this system, in the autonomic nervous system element of things, which will give you a good idea of how that might be impacting the other ones. So to do this, I'm going to introduce you to what this thermometer stands for. So when we were talking about that autonomic nervous system, I talked about being activated, so that sympathetic nervous system doing its thing, kind of being deactivated, or kind of suppressing at least the sympathetic nervous system. And so we've got this kind of shutdown or deactivated mode up here, which is our parasympathetic nervous system kind of taking over. And then at balance, we've got the two nicely leveled out. So we could do something if we wanted to, but equally we can hang out and rest. And what we can start to learn is that there's a spectrum of this activity, and we can go up and down it really quickly in a matter of seconds and minutes. And we can start to influence that ourselves. We can also recognize where we're naturally falling at across our experiences each day. So let's do a bit of an experiential practice to begin with. I'd like you just for a moment to close your eyes and just notice broadly how your body's feeling, noticing any tension in your shoulder, in your face, in your neck, in your head, how your pelvis is feeling, how your gut's feeling, what position you're in, if you're crouched over, if you're hunched, or if you're sat upright. Noticing what your breath's doing. And we're really just going to sink in for a moment to your physical experience. We're not too concerned about what your brain is saying, any narration of what's going on. We're just interested in the sensory experience. And now I'd like you to look at that nervous system thermometer chart, and without questioning or thinking too much, intuitively, just picking where you'd put yourself on that nervous system thermometer chart. What color are you in? And what physically tells you you're in that color? At kind of 7:30 in the evening, if people have been spending a lot of time in this color, you might be feeling close to this if you're ready to relax or if you're engaged in the talk, or your resources might have been burnt out a little bit and it's hard to kind of keep energy up and keep momentum. So maybe you're falling the other side. There's some activation because you're interested, but your brain is ready to switch off and you're just wanting to kind of lie back. So just noticing what that is for you, what it's like for you to notice your body in this way and use this way of identifying what your autonomic nervous system experience might be under the bonnet. And of course, this isn't an exact science, but what it does is it builds something called interoceptive awareness. So interoceptive awareness is this awareness that we can build about what's happening emotionally for us and how that sits physiologically in our body. It's joining up the two, our emotions with our physiology, because our emotions are physical as well as cognitive and a multitude of other things, really. The science on that is quite fascinating. But if we can unite our emotional experience or our experience of stress with our experience of what's happening in our body, we develop more of a kind of language and more of a indication system about where it might be useful to back off a little bit or push forward a little bit. And so we're going to use the same exercise again, but this time we're going to do it with an emphasis on how you're feeling emotionally. So closing your eyes again, reconnecting with your body, noticing how you're feeling physically. And now just giving yourself permission to feel emotions. What are the feelings that are here? For some of you, that might be really quick and easy to identify, and for others, it's really quite difficult. So that's okay, whatever your experience, just being curious and noticing. Maybe you start with just identifying which color zone you're in. Are your emotions kind of activated? Are they kind of shut down? Are you feeling good? Maybe it's somewhere in between these modes. And as you explore that, see if you can explore it emotionally and also just being curious if that comes with physical sensations. Again, just noticing. And just noticing how easy it is for you to name the feelings that you're having, the variety of feelings, the easy access that you have or the difficult access you have to really putting your finger on what the emotions are. And this brings us to our next slide, which is another process that's really important for helping us with interoceptive awareness, but also for emotion regulation more generally, which is the ability to name feelings. So I use this emotion wheel a lot with clients who find it really difficult to differentiate all of the different feelings. In fact, to begin with, they might just feel good or bad, and it might be as dichotomous as that. And what we're trying to do is break that up a little bit more. Okay, so there's bad, yes, when you say bad, is it just bad, or is it fearful or angry or disgusted or sad? And if it's good, is it happy or surprised or something else? And when they can decipher that from the kind of basic emotions in the middle, then we can move out. Yeah, I feel bad, but none of these ones. Okay, so then we can move out bad. The first tier is that bored, busy, stressed, tired, and maybe a couple of those fit. And then we can look out again, is there anything else on this outer tier as we get a bit more specific again? And I'm always curious, okay, if there's some bad feelings, are there any other feelings? Is it just in this category, or is there any kind of angry feelings, or is there any fearful feelings, or whatever else it might be? And people can take a little moment to just peruse that wheel and connect with what they're feeling. And what I encourage them to do once they've connected with those feelings is to go back to the nervous system thermometer chart and just try and join it up a little bit. And we might use just one feeling to help with that. So let's say I'm feeling, let's go back to this one, busy and rushed. When we go back to this, I might say, okay, so let's just hone in on that feeling busy and rushed. Just really get as close to it as possible, however that feels. Don't worry about exactly how that goes, but just try and connect with it. And now see if you can notice where that feels in your body and where you feel like you are on this chart. And just connecting that kind of color sense, intensity sense, and piecing that together with their physical experience, it can make people feel much more aware of what's going on in their body and how they're feeling. Because the big problem that we have with stress management is we lose those first indicators. And if we can try and get a bit more awareness experientially, sensorily of what's going on for us emotionally, then we can interrupt earlier. We might be like, whoa, I'm seeing myself steadily rise from here to here. What's going on? Maybe now is time for me to intervene. And I guess that brings us to our next point, which is, how do we intervene? So part of this is about raising awareness internally about what's going on for us, what's happening in our nervous system, what's happening for us emotionally. When we do identify, okay, I'm somewhere that I don't really ideally want to be if I can help it, how do we help ourselves out and meet ourselves? Well, first of all, I do want to acknowledge that all of the science that we have shows that that awareness in itself is an intervention. When you acknowledge how you feel and you name how you feel, two separate points, they might feel like the same, but they're two slightly separate dimensions, that automatically has a regulating impact on your emotional experience, but also what happens physiologically. So in your brain, the emotion center part of your brain is generally housed in the middle of your brain, and the thinking is like the top and the front. And when we have high emotional dysregulation or high intensity emotions, we see lots of activation in that middle part of our brain. And when we turn towards that experience and acknowledge it and build up this interoceptive awareness, we would see that this front part of our brain communicates with this middle part of our brain in a much more cooperative way. And then we see this activation reduce. And as we see that activation reduce, we see the knock-on effect on our autonomic nervous system, and our parasympathetic nervous system is more able to kick in to restore some kind of balance. So just even building that awareness, and I say just, it's actually really hard. It takes a little bit of a while, especially if it's not something you've done before, is an intervention for stress. And then labeling your feelings is a secondary intervention for stress and all sorts of, difficult emotional experiences. So working on that, giving yourself like a period to just really increase that awareness, that is plenty to begin with. But maybe soon you get to the stage and you're like, okay, but I know that there's other things that I want to do to help myself out when I'm feeling super activated or super shut down. So we'll go back to our action for allostasis and our allostatic systems. These really are some of the key areas that nurture all of these systems. Lots of these, most of these perhaps aren't surprising at all. Physical activity, diet, hydration, sleep regularity and quality. Again, are threatened brains, and therefore threat detecting brains, might kind of find all sorts of expectations of these things that we're falling below. I only work out once every 2 weeks, or I have an okay diet, but I end up eating far too many pizzas across a 3-month period or whatever. My hydration, I don't even know how much I drink. Maybe I need to drink more. And sleep regularity, I've got 2 young kids and blah, 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 blah. So, our brain's going to pick out the problems with the things already. So just notice what your automatic expectations and standards are for you, and pull it right down. If it's absolutely impossible for you to get a nice solid 7 to 8 hours sleep because you've got young kids, or you've got pain, or whatever it might be, you're dealing with a lot of stress and that's keeping you up, just try and find a baseline of where you're at on average, and just see what you can do to increase it ever so slightly. For example, with sleep, maybe it's just increasing the access to sleep by 10 minutes by starting your bedtime routine earlier. And there's a whole science of sleep architecture and homeostasis as well, which can help with that. But again, that would be another workshop in its own right, and I think you've got one coming up perhaps. But that principle applies across the board, right? What's your brain expecting that you need to do for these things? And can you just reduce that right down so that you can just have a sprinkling of lots of these different things? Physical activity doesn't mean going to the gym and high intensity exercise. It can mean like going out for a walk, and a relatively short walk as well. That's better than not doing it at all, which is the common response of our brain when we feel like we just can't do it. And then on the other side, we've got some of the more kind of psychosocial elements, which again, research shows us is super important for the nurture of all of these allostatic systems. I'll start at the top. Emotion regulation, we've talked about it. So utilizing some of those practices. Social connection is super important, and that applies for introverts as well as extroverts, but it's just about finding the social connection experiences that are nourishing for you. Not everybody likes to be amongst their family, or let alone like large crowds of friends or strangers, but there will be people that you feel like you can be comfortable with and you can have a chat with, and that doesn't mean having to sit together for hours on end either, but finding what feels net replenishing in your social connection activities and making sure you intentionally sprinkle that throughout your week. We increasingly get siloed when financial pressure builds, when work pressure builds, when there's lots of demands. We kind of hunker down and put our heads down and look forward, and those things fall off our list. But those things help give us perspective and physiologically help our body buffer against the negative effects of stress. So don't let that fall off your to-do list, or to prioritize list, really. And then quiet time, we talk about the importance of social connection, but it's also important to have time for you to not be stimulated, to not be looking at screens, to not be watching TV, to not be doing, but actually being. And again, that can feel torturous for some people, and the people it feels most torturous to probably benefit the most. But again, it doesn't have to be excessive amounts. It might be, okay, in the morning, I just have 5 minutes, not listening to anything, not doing anything, but just sitting with my thoughts, or just sitting with my cup of tea, or whatever it might be. And starting to do that helps you connect with yourself, helps your brain to reduce fear of thoughts and feelings. But it also activates a network in your brain called the default mode network. And the default mode network is this kind of region of different brain areas that gets activated all together when you're not engaged in goal-directed thinking. When you're not engaged in goal-directed thinking, your brain's just sifting over and free associating and daydreaming maybe, and just kind of sifting stuff out. But it's a really important maintenance mode that we're increasingly losing out on because of our phones. Usually when we'd be in between a task, that's when our brains could go back to our default mode. But now we're being stimulated again, and we're not seeing that activation across this network. And the default mode network helps us emotionally regulate, it helps us problem solve, it helps us be creative, it helps our body come back to homeostasis. And we know that we can get it by providing the right environment of permission not to think. You know, we're allowing our brains to think, let it do whatever, but we're not intentionally trying to. And then lastly, fulfillment, which might sound very existential, but it's a very underrated stress management thing. When we're doing lots of things for duty and for financial security and even just for fun, if we're missing out on that pillar of feeling like we're satisfying that sense of like who we are, what our values are, then it can feel like something's missing, and that can be really, really stressful. Okay, I've whistled through this to try and give some time for questions as well. So I'm happy to go back to any of this really. Seem to have lost my mouse. But I guess just to summarize before I open right up to questions, these things, you know, they may not seem massive, but we always get the same kind of talks about stress management. And what I'm always struck by is how much extra people are told to do to manage their stress and how stressful that is. And so what I want to encourage people to do is change how they approach things. It's not necessarily about doing more or doing less, but it's about having a different approach to your experience, which is more fluid, flexible, and curious of your experience and aligned with what's going on physiologically as well as emotionally. And when we increase that awareness, we can make more intentional choices. We can be more compassionate to ourselves and to others, and we can get to that equilibrium. And when that happens, our biology and our psychology work really nicely together. So yeah, thank you, everybody. And if you are interested in any of this and particular practices and strategies and doing more with the nervous system and emotion regulation and allostatic stuff, I have a membership site called Body Mind Connect. But whilst we're here, I'd love to hear if anybody's got any questions. You're welcome to put it in the Q&A. I'm just gonna. So Lucy's asked a question, would you say that overwhelm is the same as chronic stress? I mean, overwhelm is a word that's used in lots of different contexts. So I don't think every time you're overwhelmed, that means you're experiencing chronic stress. But if you repeatedly experience overwhelm, I would name that as an emotion you can have like in situ in a given moment that can pass. But if you experience it over and over and over again, then that could culminate to chronic stress, certainly. But yeah, in different contexts, it's used in different ways. Some people use overwhelm as like a means of, interchangeably kind of denoting chronic stress.
Yeah. Thank you, Sue. There's a couple more questions coming in. Thank you ever so much. It was fantastic, super interesting. I love the word wheel. I found that really
great, isn't it?
That's fantastic. So yeah, let's get to the questions. We haven't got very long. So Sarah said, can mindfulness practice and meditation help with being present and notice one's emotion and having the that time dedicated and protected?
Yeah, absolutely. So mindfulness practice I love, but it has become kind of like a dirty word as there's been more awareness generated of mindfulness. As with lots of things, the message gets diluted and there's some misconceptions of what mindfulness is, that it's this kind of like practice to get you to control your thoughts and be with your mind. But really mindfulness is, as John Kabat-Zinn, the founder of mindfulness, said, is heartfulness. It's about connecting with your emotions as well as, you know, observing your thoughts. And yeah, having a mindfulness practice that embodies that and really kind of connects with your physical and emotional experience is a fantastic way. So yeah.
Brilliant. And Alistair said, how much variation is there between individuals' experience of physical manifestation of their emotions? So
yeah, great question, Alistair. Huge, like opposite ends. For some people, they might feel sad or any emotion and they don't have any iota of what they feel in their body at all. And when you ask the question and prompt, it can get quite frustrating for them because I don't feel anything. And on the other end of the spectrum, people sometimes confuse their physical experiences, their emotional experiences, for purely like a physical thing. So across the spectrum, we can work with finding more equilibrium, but it's going to take slightly different intervention, but it can be worlds and worlds apart. But I think noticing where you are on the spectrum, and then making your kind of tailored goal towards that, is helpful.
Do you want to stop sharing your slides, Sula, so that we can see you a bit better while you're answering the questions? That's brilliant, thanks. Okay, so Francesca says, could you say more about your membership program?
Yeah, so it's called Body Mind Connect, and I developed it because there's a sparsity of health psychology provision anywhere, not just in the NHS, but anywhere. And there's a lot of people with lots of different chronic illnesses and chronic stress and burnout. And what I do in my clinical practice, working one-on-one with people, is help people understand what's happening physiologically and tailor the psychological interventions to that. And so I wanted to make that much more accessible for more people who can't afford one-to-one therapy or might not need therapy, but just want to learn how to utilize that kind of information and use these kind of practices I've talked about tonight. So really it's a hub of lots of different mind-body information divided up into different topics, and then every single week I do a workshop with a group across a particular theme.
That's brilliant.
Thank you.
Okay. And if someone is struggling to identify areas of fulfillment, what advice or strategy would you use to help someone to sort of identify things?
Yeah, great question, Meg. So it's a big question. So first of all, I think, again, taking pressure off, I think setting the scene of let's take it exploratively. Like, it's not an easy thing of like, oh, that's my fulfillment. It's more about giving yourself permission to explore and stumble upon it and kind of build up iteratively. But starting points, I would help someone identify their values. So what are the things that make you tick? What are the things that make you feel like it's important to be as a person more generally, like, to be a caring person, to honor nature, to constantly, learn, or whatever it might be. And then from there, getting creative and brainstorming, what things can be done or what areas can be explored in those kind of different themes. And again, the emphasis is on iterative and explorative. Yeah, great question.
I've got one for you before we go on to Omar's.
Yeah.
Are you able to talk a little bit about the link between IBS and stress? Because obviously we know there's a big link there, and obviously as a dietitian, I'm particularly interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, we know that there's a massive impact on stress or psychological distress and moods and IBS, but we approach IBS, I say me in my practice, and also the research that we've got, the leading, most reputable research and extensive. We see IBS from like a biopsychosocial point of view. So there's a biological component, of course, and that interacts with the psychological component. So for some people with IBS, they might have started with a bout of gastroenteritis or some kind of gut infection, SIBO or something. That starts off dysregulation in the gut, and then that creates a psychological impact, right? And a social impact. It might change whether they're able to do work, financial pressure building, that feeds into their psychological experience. And when the psychological experience is affected, that's changing how the autonomic stress response is working, which has an impact on the enteric nervous system. And across that diagram of all the different sub-branches of the nervous system, gut function becomes dysregulated. The microbiome might change. The signals from the sympathetic nervous system might mean that the gut gets activated, and then it gets kind of paused, and then it starts again, but it feels like more of a disruptive event. And so essentially the two work together, whatever kicked it off biologically or psychologically. It could be that stress started the dysregulation. The gut then gets into a bit of a rut of not being able to find its rhythm again. So that peristalsis is disrupted. And so and then that gets exaggerated with every new experience of stress.
So what would your tools be then? Do you use things like mindfulness and?
Yeah, so I use the gut directed protocol from the research study I was involved in and co-authored the manual to, it's called the active trial. And we took measurements at 3, 6, 12, and 24 months. And across all of those time measures, everybody in the CBT groups had a significant reduction in IBS symptoms, some of them no longer meeting the criteria for IBS. But the protocol was gut-directed biopsychosocial CBT protocol. So what that means is we're working with a psychological component, but predominantly to begin with, we're working with gut-directed behaviors. So we're helping people get that regularity of routine, reducing kind of boom bust behavior. If there's fear of having accidents, for example, in IBSD, then we might work on anal sphincter muscle training. If there's constipation and people are repeatedly using laxatives all of the time, we might look at if there's scope to switch that out for more hydration or more kind of fiber instead. So we're kind of moving away from gut-directed safety and avoidance behaviors. And when we start to see a shift there, then we would include as well things like working with the autonomic nervous system, although that wasn't in the original protocol, but relaxation processes, guided imagery, mindfulness, and working with really high unrelenting standards and perfectionism, which is often in there for people with IBS.
Right, so we are on 8 o'clock, but I am going to just let Omar have his last question.
Yeah.
And so it says, thank you for a very insightful presentation. Does burnout resemble the last allostatic load graph?
Yeah.
An inadequate response. So is burnout an inadequate?
Yeah, I'll just get back to that graph real quick, theoretically. If I can find it again. Yeah. Yeah, this one, exactly that. For a lot of people, can you see that?
Yeah. Okay.
For a lot of people, that is what burnout feels like, right? Just not being able to get going, having the brain fog, feeling really heavy. But for some people, they experience burnout like this. They're just like, I am so at the top of things, I can't do anything. I'm frazzled. I'm starting this, I'm starting that. So I think this is what most people would automatically associate, but it can also be this one too.
So thank you so much for your time, Sula. It was
sure.
super interesting and insightful. I'm sure we could have gone on for a lot longer.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Obviously getting lovely messages coming through saying thank you.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
Have a lovely evening, everybody.
Have a lovely evening. Bye.